We are in Ezekiel chapter 40 to 48 is the section that we are going to start, although we are not going to be reading and digging into the text of Ezekiel as much or at all this morning. Instead, we want to kind of just talk about what to expect as we get into this section. By the way, before I forget, because I've missed 2 golden opportunities or more in the last few months, as you may know, on our Monday night Zoom gathering, we've been doing some different things each week. We kind of have a rotating schedule each month. And on the last Monday of the month, what we've been doing is just reading larger portions of Scripture. And so far this year, we've been reading through the book of Ezekiel intentionally to overlap that reading with what we're studying in this class. And so it's been really helpful, at least to me, just reading through about half an hour of text each month out of Ezekiel. And sometimes it's just worked out perfectly that what we're reading on Monday is exactly where we are in our class on Sundays and Wednesdays. And that's the case for this final reading, which we'll do tomorrow night. So tomorrow night at 7 o'clock on Zoom, we are going to be reading Ezekiel 40 to the end of the book, 40 to 48. And so that'll be a great way, especially hopefully after this class, kind of setting up what to expect in these chapters, and then reading all of that together on tomorrow night. And then starting Wednesday, we will work our way through chapter 40, through the end of the book. And then we'll be done. By the end of August, we'll have finished Ezekiel and be moving on to other things. So, our plan today, or I say our objectives today, are to do a few things. One, we're going to do some review to start out, primarily so that Ezekiel 40 to 48 can be placed in its proper context. Kind of remind ourselves what's been going on in Ezekiel, not only here recently, but also over the course of the book, the various visions that Ezekiel has seen, and how it leads up to this final vision in Ezekiel 40 to 48. We're going to talk about some other passages in the Old Testament, particularly the construction of the Tabernacle in the book of Exodus and the construction of the temple in the book of 1 Kings. And so hopefully by the end of today's class, you can recall some important things about those 2 passages, and then offer a basic explanation for this very strange passage in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 to 48, in which we see more instructions and more details given about another structure, another temple that Ezekiel is seeing and having described for him and describing to us. It's weird, it's odd, but hopefully by the end of today you could at least say this is why this is in here, or maybe one reason why this is in our Bibles. So, you have on your handout, the first thing you have on there is review. Take a minute, 2, 3, 4 minutes with the people around you if you want to work together. Some of us are protective about our answers. We'd rather do it ourselves and get it all right than share those answers with other people and have them benefit from our knowledge. I was that way, am that way, so that's fine. But if you'd like to work together. Give you about 3 minutes or so just to do the matching from the hope section of Ezekiel, chapters 33 to 39 up to this point. Take a few minutes, work on it, and then we'll go over the answers here Okay. We have a lot of people that are either possessive or really good whisperers. So, see how you did here. Remember that starting in chapter 33, we, for the most part, leave behind the messages of judgment, which we saw primarily in Ezekiel from chapters 1 to 32. And we enter into a section where there are pictures of hope for God's people in the future, now that the city of Jerusalem has been destroyed by the Babylonians as a sign of God's punishment. So these are mainly what these pictures are. What is chapter 33 about? Which matching item did you get there? Yeah, 33 is maybe a transition chapter. That is where we learn that Jerusalem falls, and Ezekiel is told again that he is to be the watchman, and the people are told that Ezekiel is the warning man, the watchman of Israel. Then in chapter 34, what did you get there? The shepherds. Thank you, Michael. That's E. And who are the shepherds, by the way? Kings and leaders. That's a good general answer there. And so by the end of that chapter, there's a beautiful picture of hope that God himself will be the shepherd of his people, and David will come. Messianic anticipation there of David coming to be the shepherd. All right, 35 and 36 go together. What's 35? Mount Seir. I heard Brian with the Seir there. Mount Seir is Edom, as you see here. And so they are condemned for their plundering, assisting in the plundering of Judah. And then in chapter 36, what do we see? Yeah, the mountains of Israel. That would be number B. As opposed to Mount Seir, which is judged, the mountains of Israel are blessed in the future. People will be resettled there. They will dwell securely again on the mountains of Israel. 37. Yeah, those dry bones are revived by the Spirit of God. There's also a section at the end of that chapter about two nations, the divided kingdom, becoming one nation and one people. And then it's the only one left, but 38 and 39 are this description of Gog from the land of Magog, horrible armies that are destroyed by God to show his people that he is their God. He's going to protect them going forward, and to show the nations that he alone is God, and he is all powerful and he is just as well. Okay, so that's what we've seen in this message of hope so far, and that then sets up chapter 40. I will say, just by way of linking some of this together here, 38 and 39 were kind of a weird, if we're honest about that, interlude. But if you go back to chapter 37, you see it in your Bible. 37, as you see up here, was the picture of revival. The people were dead, and they are revived by God, by his blessing, by his Spirit. And then they are brought together in the end of chapter 37 to be one people, and there are again these promises of blessing from God. And notice what he says in 37 verse 26 when he says, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant with them. I will set them in their land and multiply them and set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God. They shall be my people. The nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary will be in their midst. Now, again, what is a sanctuary? A temple, right? You can come up with other synonyms, but the temple is what is being referred to here. Okay, remember, the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And so right here in 37, in this picture of God gathering his people back into the land, he says twice, I will put my temple, I will put my sanctuary in their midst. And again, once we get through the interlude of Gog and Magog, which had its own messages to send, as we saw last week, we come to that sanctuary. We come to that temple that is being described in Ezekiel 40 to 48. So there's a link there between the promises of hope earlier in this section and what we see here at the very end of Ezekiel. Now, the other thing we see is that chapter 40 begins a vision. And it says in chapter 40, verse 1, that the hand of the Lord was upon me. And in verse 2, it says, in visions of God, he brought me to the land of Israel. This is a vision that Ezekiel is seeing. The hand of God is on him to show him a vision. And there's 3 other times in the book that the hand of the Lord is said to be on Ezekiel, and he sees a vision from God. Let's do this together. You can shout these out. No elaborate description needed unless there's more you want to say about it. Well, let's remind ourselves of the 3 visions so far. 3 times that the Spirit of the Lord or the hand of the Lord has been upon Ezekiel to show him something. What happened in the first 3 chapters? What was that vision about? The glory of God on his throne. Not in chapters 1 to 3, although that was part of his message, of his call to be a prophet. But in the call of Ezekiel to be a prophet, he is shown the likeness, remember, the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God is what he saw. A throne chariot carried by these, or sitting on top of, these 4 living creatures, or cherubim, as they are referred to in later chapters. And it is an amazing scene, but is a scene of God on the move. He's coming to Babylon in this throne chariot, sitting on top of these cherubim, these winged creatures flying all around. Okay, in chapters 8 to 11, Ezekiel, who remember is in Babylon, grabbed by the hair and taken in a vision to Jerusalem. And what does he see in chapters 8 through 11? And why is God leaving the temple? If Michael's right about that, which he is. Why does God leave the temple in chapters 8 to 11? And what's going on in the temple? That's right. Almost literally the worst stuff you could imagine. Idolatrous worship, pagan worship, idols, pagan carvings, bowing down to the sun, moon, and stars. All that happening in the temple itself in chapter 8. Okay? And so there is the slaughter, the judgment that he sees in this vision in chapter 9. And then the glory of God, the same picture from chapters 1 to 3, this throne chariot resting on the living creatures, it's picking up from out of the temple and it's moving kind of slowly to the courtyard, to the gate, eventually then out to the Mount of Olives outside of the city of Jerusalem. God's glory, his presence is leaving the temple, leaving the city of Jerusalem because of their forsaking of his commandments. Okay? And then we mentioned chapter 37 already. 37 is one of the visions. It says the same language, the hand of the Lord was on me, took me down to a valley to see the bones of this slain army. And this connects, I believe, because of the picture that we talked about in this chapter of just utter hopelessness, right? They're dead, dry bones that have been there forever. You think about chapters 8 to 11 and put it together with chapter 37, what hope could there be for a people who were so lost in their idolatry and who had for so many generations rebelled against God that God just up and left? He had been so patient with them, generation after generation. The fact that he finally left results in the beginning of chapter 37. They're hopeless without God there. And yet, the vision itself is a vision of hope for the future when God restores his people, literally breathes life back into them, and they become an army once again. So a little bit of a different metaphor, but it's the same idea basically that's leading us back to chapters 40 to 48, where in a previous vision, Ezekiel had seen the current temple before it was destroyed, and God leaving it. Now Ezekiel is taken out of the valley of dry bones up onto a high mountain to see a new temple where God's glory will come to dwell. Okay, we'll return to this before we're done. In some ways, we're just going to keep reiterating this over and over again for the next half hour. Okay, but those are the visions in Ezekiel and where this final vision fits in. Any comments or questions on this part of it? Kind of what's been going on in Ezekiel recently, or what we've seen in Ezekiel and these visions stretching back all the way to chapter 1. Anything here? Questions, comments? Cool. All right. Two passages of Scripture that we want to just talk about. And you can be looking at these in your Bible if you want. There are some references. Could have put more references. There are references of verses on your handout. These are not going to be on the PowerPoint for the sake of space. But they are on your handout, and there will be other things in these passages of worth. And so if you want to read these passages, these chapters later, or look at the references later, or right now, follow along in these sections of Scripture, we're going to just briefly talk about the construction of the tabernacle first, and then the construction of the temple. One of the things that's interesting about the construction of the tabernacle is that it is in many ways the climax of the book of Exodus. Okay, Exodus is one of those weird books where you first start reading it and you're like, this is awesome. I love Exodus. It's exciting. It's action-packed, right? The people are enslaved in Egypt. God is, coming out with his plagues, and he's punishing Pharaoh, and there's this drama with him not letting them leave, and then takes him to the Red Sea, death of the firstborn, takes him to the Red Sea parts. They get through. It's just wonderful. It's all what all of our kids' stories are made of. And then you get to like the second half of the book, and you're like, man, Exodus is really boring. Because right about chapter, it's really 19, they finally get to the wilderness of Sinai, And starting in chapter 20, it's like laws and instructions. And the whole rest of the book is laws and instructions. And you're like, well, this is lame. Where's the action? In our way of thinking, the action-packed stuff should be the main point. But I think if you look at the book of Exodus, the way it's written, the main point is really this second half of the book. That the reason God delivered them from Egypt, well, you could probably tell me this. The reason he delivered them from Egypt and brought them out, what was God wanting all along? Why did he do all of that? I will be your God, you will be my people. The covenant, okay? This relationship, this covenant relationship that he desired with them. And that's said several times throughout the book of Exodus. But it is said explicitly in chapter 25 and 26, as you see there, or 25 and 29, in relation to the building of the tabernacle, okay? The tabernacle was going to be the place that represented God's dwelling place with his people. So let me just read you. I may dwell in their midst is taken right from Exodus 25. But I was going to read you a little bit longer passage in Exodus 29. Again, in the middle of all these elaborate descriptions of the rooms and the furniture and the different things that would be in the tabernacle, he says in Exodus 29, verse 45, I will dwell among the people of Israel, and I will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. Okay. So, what to us seems like boring, tedious details about the tabernacle and how it was to be constructed, really is just an amazing, profound reality. Okay, that the God of heaven and earth is going to have a place where he can dwell, live with his people in this covenant relationship. That's what this is all about. And when you start to understand that, you start to understand why it takes up so much space in the book of Exodus. And it's actually worse than that. There's a lot of repetition. There's several chapters from 25 to 30 of the instructions for the tabernacle, and then 31. And then 32 is the golden calf incident. So right in the middle of God wanting to dwell with his people, they go back to their idolatry. Okay, so we've seen that message in Ezekiel. But then once all of that is resolved, then 35 to the end of the book is all the same stuff you read when you were reading the instructions, but it's just talking about how they follow those instructions, right? So there's literally some verbatim repeating of God told them to build the tabernacle this way, and then they built it this way. But again, the repetition and the space that it takes up is to emphasize this point here. The tabernacle was where God would dwell with his people. Now, the basis for that, we just mentioned God's instructions, but it's a little bit deeper than that. These are not necessarily arbitrary instructions, although Steve's lesson this morning was a good reminder that we don't have to have good reasons for us of why these instructions were the way they were. But one thing that's interesting is that there is an indication that what Moses was told, really is what he saw on the mountain, was a heavenly reality. In Exodus, let's see, it's here, 25 and verse 40, and it's repeated again. God tells Moses, see, I'll read it exactly here, 25 verse 40, see that you make them, that is the instruments here, the furniture that that they're making for the tabernacle, see that you make them after the pattern for them, which is being shown to you on the mountain. The idea is that Moses was up there seeing heavenly realities. The book of Hebrews talks about this as well, that what was in the tabernacle, the layout of the tabernacle, was a heavenly reality, and the physical things that they built and constructed and placed were simply the representations. Okay, and that's why it was so important. Or what should I say? One of the reasons. Again, if God says it, we do it. But the reason God was saying, these are the instructions, you follow it to a T, was because he was copying, he was showing him a heavenly reality, a picture of heavenly things that was to be replicated on the earth. And so that's the basis for this tabernacle, was the heavenly things that Moses was seeing. And then to point out a few features of this, one is that the tabernacle was the place where the Ark of the Covenant would reside in the Holy of Holy Places, the most holy place. And the Ark of the Covenant was essentially a throne. It was a mercy seat with two cherubim on either side of that could be carried around from place to place. And what does all that remind us of? We talked about this in this class. A throne with cherubim that could move from place to place. Oh, that's what we saw in Ezekiel 1. And it's another iteration of the same point we just made. You see the copy of God's throne in the Ark of the Covenant. In Ezekiel 1, I'm not going to say you see the real thing, but you see something much closer to the real thing. This amazing picture of God's throne. Well, that's what the Ark of the Covenant was always supposed to represent and to be a picture of, where God sits. And he sits in the Holy of Holy Places. In the tabernacle, that's where he sits and dwells with his people. And then a couple things about the tabernacle, and then we'll repeat it with the temple. One is that there is similarities with the tabernacle to a house. Okay, it's kind of some of those weird things like, why is there a table and a lamp in the tabernacle? I mean, the priests went in and out, and they did stuff like keeping the bread fresh, I guess. But there's no real indication that the priests hung out in the tabernacle. And yet there's these elements of a dwelling place, a table and a lamp and bread and all this stuff. It's a picture of, again, abiding, of God, particularly dwelling with his people. And there's also some garden imagery. The tabernacle, you remember, was temporary. It was, packed up and moved from place to place. And so it's much more austere, okay? Meaning that it was, built for functionality, and there wasn't as much of the decorative flourishing as there would be in the permanent structure, the temple. But even still, you see in the tabernacle carvings of almond branches and flowers on the lampstand in particular, and things that kind of point us to garden imagery. You'll see it more clearly with the temple, but you see it in the tabernacle as well. And then the conclusion of the book of Exodus, maybe this is the climax in chapter 40 of Exodus. The final picture is that once the tabernacle is completed and consecrated, this cloud of God's glory comes and fills the tabernacle, a picture of God's presence among his people. Okay, questions or comments on the tabernacle as described to us in the book of Exodus? Yeah, Brian.
It occurred to me that when we're talking about the temple, the tabernacle, and it was carried around, it seems to me that it indicates that God's presence moves with his people. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, of course, the temple is our bodies. When Jesus said, you no longer worship in this mountain or in the temple, because we worship God in our hearts. God is with us is the point, as I'm trying to say, not just in one spot.
Oh, thank you, Brian. And I believe it was Mike Ryan, still a little bit bitter after what happened last week with Mike. So I hesitate to give him any credit for anything. But I can't remember if it was in the opening vision, 1-3, where you see the royal throne chariot showing up to Ezekiel in Babylon, or whether it was in 8-11. I think it might have been there, where God's glory is leaving the temple in Jerusalem, that it was the same point. The people had become so attached to the physical space of the temple, and you could maybe see why with what we're talking about, with the tabernacle and the temple, and that symbolizing God's dwelling place. But they had become so fixated on the location that they had missed that, no, this is about God's presence. And in reality, God's presence isn't just in one place. We'll see that in a second. And the fact that it was moving out of Jerusalem and moving to Babylon shows that God is with his people who are in Babylon, not stuck in the building that was still in Jerusalem. And they really needed to get that through their heads because they had become so attached to the physical place. Okay, so thank you, Brian, and thank you, Mike. Anything else on the tabernacle? And we'll talk about the temple here. Yeah. Are you good?
Not only is it the vision of heaven, but is it not also a prophetic figure of the church?
We'll talk about it. You're talking about Ezekiel or about the tabernacle?
The tabernacle and the temple, the holy place, the most holy place.
Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about that by the time we're done. But my answer would be yes. I think what you see in these pictures is kind of a principle, a reality that is fulfilled now in Jesus. Jesus calls himself the temple in John 2. Paul says that we, as God's people, are the temple. Peter says the same thing. And then yet all of this still has fulfillment yet to come when we are truly dwelling with God forever. Okay. So we could probably move through the temple a little bit more quickly because it's a lot of the same stuff. Now moving to the backside of your handout. Again, picking up the language of covenant, it is clear that the temple is a critical element of God's covenant that he had with David. So this is a little bit different. We talked about the idea of covenant in Exodus. That right there is the covenant that God is creating, is making with his people at Sinai. Okay, with the law of Moses given and the covenant relationship he makes with his people there, and giving the 10 Commandments and all that. And the tabernacle is, this manifestation of the dwelling place that God has with his people in this covenant with the law of Moses. But the temple is more directly tied to another covenant that God made in 2 Samuel 7. You have that on your handout. And what happens in 2 Samuel 7, to briefly review, is that David looks around and has a very, God calls it a good thought, and a natural thought. He looks around and says, man, I got this really nice palace here, but we still got that tent, that tabernacle, that portable dwelling place from the wilderness. We're still using that. And yet, God deserves much more than that. I'm going to build God a temple. Okay? But God comes to David and says, wait a second, okay? I didn't say for that to happen, okay? I didn't tell you to do that, and so you're not going to do that, but your son will build a temple. And really that turns into a promise. God uses that play on words and says, you won't build me a house, I'm going to build you a house, and talks about this everlasting kingdom, this dynasty that's going to come from the line of David, that there will always be a son of David to sit on the throne forever. And so obviously that is this promise, this covenant that has foreshadowings of the Messiah. But part of that is you're going to have a son that will build a house, will build a temple for me. And Solomon is that son, at least in the immediate fulfillment of that. And you'll notice in Solomon's speech in 1 Kings chapter 8, he retells that story. It says, this is what happened with my dad. God told him he was going to have a son that was going to build a temple, and that's what we've just done. We've built this temple in honor of that and fulfillment of that promise that God had made. But what's interesting, one of my favorite things about Solomon's speech is that, the people understand, and he understands. We've already talked about it, okay? This idea that the temple, which is just a permanent structure that is the same as the tabernacle, same layout, all that, same purpose. We understand this is the dwelling place of God. This is where God dwells with his people. But yet Solomon understands something else that we've already touched on. And that is in 1 Kings 8 and verse 27, he says, after saying, okay, we have this covenant, God's going to dwell with his people, Solomon says, but will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Okay, that's an important and I think an impressive statement for Solomon to make at the dedication of the temple. To say, yeah, this is where God dwells with his people, but not really. Okay, a house can't contain God. I mean, heaven and earth can't contain him. Okay, so how would this house do the same thing? So this is the purpose, but there is there's an impossibility with this. The basis for the temple is not as explicit as the tabernacle. Again, we said the tabernacle, God shows Moses the pattern, tells him, keep these instructions, do that, and then Moses does it. It's not the same explicit, process described with the temple, but there is a passage, as you'll note there in 1 Kings chapter 6, where God tells Solomon, concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. I think God is talking about a larger sense of you need to obey all the commandments, but there is likely a sense in which the construction of the temple itself was, given, the instructions to some degree, if maybe not just the basic instructions that Moses had received, that they were copying, have their root in God's mind and in God's commandments. And then in terms of features, we point out the same things we pointed out with the tabernacle. Over and over again, this temple is referred to as the house of the Lord, or God's house. Again, this idea of dwelling place. The garden imagery is much stronger in the temple, again, because it's much more ornate. But the cedar panelings of the inside of the temple, they're all carved. I mean, so it must have been an amazing sight to behold. But it's all carved, the inside. So when you're in the temple, you're in the midst of pictures of palm trees and flowers and blossoms, okay, and animals as well, okay. All this stuff reminding us of a garden. There are 2 huge pillars of bronze at the top of the domes. There are hundreds of pomegranates carved into those pillars. The imagery of the garden is very strong. Now, we didn't stop to ask before, but I'll ask you now, why a garden? Why pictures of a garden in the tabernacle and then much, more fully in the temple? Yeah, Drew?
Oftentimes people go to Genesis 1 as an explanation of origins, but there's also kind of the first temple shown in the Bible through Genesis 1 through 3 of that overlapping of the abode of God in heaven and man that he's created on earth, this ordered place, that imagery. And so you see it repeated over and over throughout the subsequent temples, tabernacles of the Old Testament, that this is an abode where God's dwelling overlaps with mankind's dwelling.
Thank you, Drew. And I'm going to restrain myself here because we have almost a month to cover these chapters. And this is going to be, so if you want to jot it down or keep it in your mind, this is going to be one of the main things we'll try to highlight in this final section of Ezekiel. The various connections between Ezekiel's temple that he is seeing in his book, his vision, and the Garden of Eden, and what God did, what God was doing. Not just because one way to think of it is to say when you're in the temple and you see flowers and blossoms and fruit and animals, you think, oh, this is like going back to the Garden of Eden, right? This is where God dwelled fully with his people, with humans that he made. And so we're returning to that dwelling place of God when we walk into the temple, okay? But as Drew is highlighting, there's also in those early chapters of Genesis important kind of pictures, important statements made about God and what he did when he created the world and putting boundaries and separating things and turning chaos into order, and also what his purpose was for man and how man was to serve in the creation as priests in that temple that he created in the first garden, the first temple. And so all of this kind of stacks on top of each other. But I want us to see that in the tabernacle and the temple, the garden imagery, the pictures of the Garden of Eden were already there. So be looking for that in Ezekiel's temple, and then we'll talk about kind of the significance of that as we go. And then we'll just say about the Temple of Solomon that it was visually impressive. Not only the size of it, but also the gold. I mean, everything almost is covered in gold and bronze. I mean, it would have been truly magnificent sight to behold. And I put on there the passage in the book of Ezra. You may remember this, that when the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and then the people come back 70 years later, and they start building a new temple, and it says that there was this big cry from the people when they saw the foundation of this new temple. And it says that some of the people were crying for joy because it's like, we finally are getting a temple again. But the other half, the older half, were crying because this puny little temple paled in comparison to the temple that they remembered in the days of Solomon. It stuck with them. You think they're kids when they saw that. And then they come back and they think, man, that temple of Solomon was so visually impressive, and what we've done is just a sorry kind of redo of that. So Solomon's temple would have been a sight to behold. And repeating again the story of Exodus in 1 Kings, when the temple is completed, then the cloud of God's glory fills it. Okay, I'm going to bypass opportunities for questions or comments there to talk about Ezekiel's temple, and then we'll pick up in chapter 40 on Wednesday. So, as we've already said, if you want to think, okay, one very simple thing to say about Ezekiel 40 to 48 is that this is the end of the story. This is the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, right? We already saw the cloud of God's glory leaving the temple currently in Jerusalem, and so now we have a picture of a new temple in which God will come back. And I highlighted this at the very beginning of our study because it's, again, just a nice way to think of the basic message of Ezekiel. In chapter 43, verse 5, we have the opposite of what we saw back in chapter 9, 10, and 11. The glory of the Lord, it says in 43:5, fills the temple. Okay? And then the final, this is awesome to me, the final words of the book of Ezekiel, the very end of chapter 48, is that the Lord is there. That's the name of the city. The name of the city from that time on shall be, the Lord is there. Early chapters of Ezekiel describing God leaving. God is not with his people because they have been unfaithful to him. The end of Ezekiel is God comes back to be with his people. He dwells with them. The Lord is there. Now, I think that was a bell. Am I right on that? So a couple quick things, and these are things that we'll continue to refer to. But two things that this is not, and then we'll try to say what this is. One is that I do not think that this description of the temple in Ezekiel 40 to 48, I don't think it can be the temple that God expected his people to build when they came back. That's one thing people have thought. Well, Ezekiel's in Babylon. They're still exiles. And so maybe he's getting, like Moses did, the instructions to go back and build this thing when exile is over. I don't think that's the case. There's a couple things about it. There's some impossibilities about this temple. One is there's one detail that kind of represents a larger point here. I hate to even spoil it, but there's a wonderful picture in chapter 47 of a spring that flows out of the heart of the temple, and then as it's running out of the temple, it becomes a creek and then a river, and then it flows down to the Dead Sea. And this spring that comes out of the house of God flows down to the Dead Sea, cures the Dead Sea, and there can be life in the Dead Sea now because it's been freshened up by this spring. Well, there's no spring like that in Jerusalem, okay? And I think that's also probably like an ecological impossibility. I don't know. Some of y'all, ask Justin. He probably knows about that, whether fresh water can like overpower salt water and turn it into a haven of life. I don't know. But it's clearly things like that. It's like, this doesn't seem literal or even possible. And then the land is going to be split. This is not just a description of the temple, but also of the land and how the land's going to be divided up. It's a different allotment and different geography even than what the tribes had been given under the covenant of the law of Moses. So there seems to be enough kind of exaggerated and impossible and different things. This is not instructions for the people to go back to Judea and build this thing, this temple, and divide the land the way that Ezekiel is describing. I would also say that these are features that can't work for building a temple under the new covenant. That's another thing that a lot of people have said, that at some point in the future, in the covenant of Christ, we're going to build this temple. Ezekiel's temple is going to become a reality. I don't think it's that either. There's some kind of, we're in the picture in Ezekiel 40 to 48, we're seeing animal sacrifices, okay, and instructions for those sacrifices. That doesn't seem to fit. The book of Hebrews talks about the doing away of the animal sacrifices Jesus is the only sacrifice that is needed anymore. As has already been mentioned, the New Testament's clear that the temple now is fulfilled in Jesus. It's fulfilled in God's people. We are the living stones that are being built up, and that it seems clear that there's not a need for a physical building in the new covenant. And even in John's picture of the new heavens and the new earth, which will be another important passage, because when John sees this vision in Revelation 21 and 22, much of the imagery is coming out of Ezekiel 40 to 48, and we'll see that. But in that vision, it says in Revelation that there's not a temple in that new heavens and new earth because God is perfectly dwelling with his people. Okay? So again, that would seem to point to the fact that this is not something that's going to be constructed even in the new covenant, constructed as written as a literal building. So this is what I'll say, and we'll keep repeating it over and over again. Ezekiel 40 to 48 is, I think, this. It's a symbolic description of God dwelling with his people. Okay? That's what this is about. This is a picture of God dwelling with his people. It's a picture that uses stunning imagery, but that uses symbolic imagery, okay? And how is it fulfilled? Well, it's fulfilled when God dwells with his people. I believe that begins with the exiles coming back and restarting in the land, but it's much more than that, okay? Really, this is fulfilled in Jesus, God with us, God dwelling with his people, and ultimately has its greatest fulfillment in the age to come in that picture that John sees of the new heavens and new earth. In Revelation 21 and 22, God says, I will dwell with my people and be their God. They will be my people. And so Ezekiel 40 to 48 is a picture, a description of that reality that is yet to come in Jesus and in the age to come. So instead of dissecting the numbers and the details, these visions are intended to be imagined. You're supposed to see this. You're supposed to see it in your mind's eye and imagine what it is that Ezekiel is seeing. But the symbols themselves are important. And one great way to read Bible symbols is to think of other places in the Bible where that symbol shows up. We've already done that a little bit this morning. When you read stuff that sounds like a garden, think, where have I seen that before? Oh, I've seen it in Genesis 1 to 3, for instance. So what are the connections there? The Bible is full of these symbols, and the symbols are oftentimes used in similar ways from Old Testament to Old Testament or Old Testament to New Testament. And so pick up on the symbols and think symbolically and think in terms of connections to other passages. And finally, Jesus, for everything in the Old Testament, is the interpretive key. So all of this should point to him in some way. Jesus himself, things that Jesus said, what we have available to us in Jesus, all of that should be prefigured, foreshadowed by what's being described in Ezekiel 40 to 48. Okay, join us tomorrow night on Zoom, and we will read all these chapters, and then we'll start digging in on Wednesday. Thank you, guys.